during the summer when people try to have the opportunity to study Torah in a more in-depth way and offer their insights. And we are very lucky that Judy has been willing to do that for us this evening. So Judy, let's learn.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom. And I will say, first off, while we are discussing Torah in the broadest sense, we are actually discussing the holiday or holy day or sad day that is this weekend. So if we were in person, however, I would ask how many of you have heard of Tisha B'Av. And I would assume that there would be several of you who would raise their hands, particularly anyone who looked at tidbits or was at services a couple of weeks ago when Rabbi Sobo mentioned it. I would also ask how many of you observe the day in any manner, and I would assume that very few of you would answer that you do. That is really understandable. At its root, Tisha B'Av is a day of mourning for the destruction of the first and second temples, along with Jerusalem. Reform Judaism, a movement born in 19th century rationalism, has been hesitant to observe a holiday grieving the temples, whose religious role feels opposite to our modern sensibilities. We don't long for the day when the temple in Jerusalem can be rebuilt, and the idea of animal or even grain sacrifices is something between appalling and laughable. And even reading Lamentations, which starts, "Alas, lonely sits the city once great with people," feels incongruous with our current experience of Jerusalem as a vibrant city in a rebuilt Israel. Why bother? For over 1,000 years, however, Jews have mourned, chanted the Book of Lamentations, and fasted on Tisha B'Av, not only for the destruction of the temple, but in memory of all Jewish suffering. Indeed, some of those disastrous events, like the beginning of the First Crusade in the 11th century and the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492, occurred on Tisha B'Av. Unlike Yom HaShoah, which was established to commemorate only the Holocaust, Tisha B'Av has been the day to mourn all Jewish loss. I was raised in Reform synagogues and never heard about Tisha B'Av until I was in college and read Rabbi Arthur Waskow's book, God Wrestling. The first time I attended a Tisha B'Av service was the year after I graduated from college when I was living in Washington, D.C. Rabbi Waskow, who had recently moved to Philadelphia, came back to lead that service at the congregation he had once attended. I found the chanting of Lamentations in a darkened room hauntingly beautiful. It was the early 1980s and the middle of the Cold War. Rabbi Waskow gave a sermon connecting the fires that destroyed the temple with the ongoing potential for nuclear destruction. Today, Rabbi Waskow often writes about the connection between the fires of Jerusalem's destruction and the fires created by global climate change. My experience then, and my point now, is not the specific examples that Rabbi Waskow has given, important as they are, but that Tisha B'Av, like all Jewish holidays, is constantly being given new meaning by every generation. At major Jewish holidays, we are encouraged to think about what the holiday means for us as individuals, for the Jewish people, or for the world, given the current circumstances of that given year. At Passover, we ask what types of liberation we need. At Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we reflect on the past year, think about what we could have done better, and resolve to try to improve our behavior. Every year at Tisha B'Av, I find myself asking, are there losses that need to be mourned? Personal ones, communal ones? In this second summer of the pandemic, which is both so dramatically different than last year, and in some ways too similar. The question of what needs to be mourned is like the blast of a shofar demanding my attention. A year ago, 4 months into the pandemic, I remember thinking about the number of Americans who had died, about 151,000 at that point, and our need to grieve not only that, but also that our sense of normalcy had utterly collapsed. Not talking to people in the grocery store, minimal in-person contact, and adjusting to life online gave Tisha B'Av a special poignancy. We were mourning the world as it had been. Here we are, a year later, 16 months into the pandemic, and over 605,000 Americans have died. Are there any of us who don't know at least one person who has died from COVID, or has long haulers effects, or was in the hospital with it? There were weeks last winter when the point of my getting online was to check if my friends and family were safe, and if I needed to offer support and condolences to those who had lost loved ones. While we have made advances, our sense of fragility remains. There is a vaccine, although getting it to 7 billion people on the planet is a huge challenge. As it turns out, even getting it to many in the United States who have been willingly vaccinated against polio, mumps, and whooping cough has become a monumental task. The societal fractures which were exposed under the pressure of the start of the pandemic have turned into fissures and fault lines threatening to tear society apart. My sense for the need for mourning this year is even greater than last year. Rabbinic tradition teaches that the Second Temple was destroyed because of baseless hatred. I find that idea both attractive and profoundly disturbing. It disturbs me because it is a way of blaming the victim, even if it is the victims who are blaming themselves. Self-blame for what one has no control over is a way of trying to convince oneself that you really have control. On the other hand, there is a truth in connecting the ideas of mourning and baseless hatred. We are not at our best when we are in the midst of grief. The known world with a loved one in it, or a job that we loved, or a society that we understood is gone, and we feel raw and vulnerable. Our grief may turn to fear or rage. There is a Talmudic story about Kamsa and Bar Kamsa that Rabbi Sobo told during services a couple of weeks ago. The shortened version is that Bar Kamsa was mistakenly invited to the party of his enemy, who then kicked him out. Bar Kamsa begged for his honor to be retained, but the host refused, and the others at the banquet, many of whom were leaders in the community, didn't come to his defense when he was being publicly humiliated. When the Talmudic rabbis discuss baseless hatred, they seem to mean this: one shouldn't shame even an enemy if one can avoid it. I completely agree. The question remains, however, is there more to understand about the term of baseless hatred? If there is anything that I have thought about in this last year, and particularly in the last 3 or 4 months, it is the amount of baseless hatred in the United States that has increased over the past several years, but particularly since the start of the pandemic. What does it mean to hate someone for no reason? Aside from the Talmudic rabbis, who, as I stated above, seem to mean publicly shaming someone or refusing to stand up for someone being shamed, they aren't particularly clear about what they mean. Most of the time, if we are angry or go so far as to say we hate someone, we can give a reason. Perhaps it is a legitimate reason, or perhaps it is an excuse. But I suspect very few people perceive their hatred as baseless. Even someone expressing hatred of another person because of race, gender, or creed will argue that their hatred is justified. In the last 16 months, we as a nation have been dealing with both a pandemic and dramatic political events. There have been good reasons to be frightened, to feel angry, to feel powerless. So many Americans are acting out their feelings. People are driving recklessly and too fast. Road rage has increased. Mass shootings over the past 16 months have skyrocketed past our already dramatic high numbers. Domestic violence and mental health issues have become a top priority of police and medical personnel. The political tensions in the country are erupting in the personal lives of so many Americans. We have reached a point where we assume the worst of those with whom we disagree. Berating and shaming people online or in person has become far too normalized. As the Talmudic rabbis asserted, baseless hatred of those with whom we are in conflict can lead to disaster. So how do we change? Can we remember that the person with whom we disagree is also B'Tselem Elohim, made in the image of God? Can we remember that we might be feeling overwhelmed by fear and anger at changes that seem so out of our control, that those with whom we may have the most profound disagreements are also most likely driven by fear and a sense of loss? Recently, I've been thinking about the response of the Park Hill neighborhood in Denver to white flight in the 1960s. They began a series of afternoon teas, followed by some evening programs to get neighbors talking to one another. White flight never happened there in that neighborhood, and it is still the most integrated neighborhood in Denver. Somehow, in some ways, we need to learn to talk with our neighbors again, and our coworkers, and even our enemies. It is unrealistic to expect that we will never be angry, never give in to our fear, especially when it is elicited by grief. For me, the gift of Tisha B'Av is to be able to take an evening or a day to remind myself to grieve those communal losses that might otherwise lead me to yelling or self-righteous condemnation of others, and to try to respond instead with random acts of kindness. If the driver next to me is in that much of a hurry, I can let him in. If my neighbor insists on explaining why COVID isn't real, I can still ask her how her aging parent is doing. Basic human decency can heal a lot of wounds. Tisha B'Av begins Saturday night. May this be a weekend of healing from our individual and communal losses, as well as a time for renewed trust and faith in one another. Amen.
Amen. And Yasher Koach. Such beautiful, profound, and important words. And I thank you so much for how well you express them and raising these issues at a time when I think so many of us are feeling it. And thank you for speaking to our hearts and giving us your truth. We now